Well, we're going to get started. Our sectional here is really kind of a two-parter. It's kind of a what, and then that's the first part, and then the so what as part two, taking a look at the advent of our universal government-sponsored education system throughout our country, for the most part pretty well administered and financed through taxation on state levels throughout our country. Most of us, and that certainly includes me, growing up or whatever, never read any kind of a work on the history of American education. I taught at Concordia University in Chicago, the first Lutheran Teachers College in our synod, founded back in the 1860s, in which it was our business to raise up future teachers for our church, and many also in the public school system. But still, throughout most all of those years, really was rather oblivious to the history of American education, particularly American government-sponsored public education as opposed to private or parochial schools and education. And my general impression was always that whatever went on in the area of history of American public education, whatever it was put into place to replace, was for the purposes, at least of those who sought to put it into place, to provide, in their minds anyways, a better education than they thought what was in place before. And that whatever it was that has evolved, whether it was successful or not anyways, the fundamental intent anyways, was always trying to improve education. That is, that the process of pedagogy somehow would be more effective in being able to educate children. I just naturally thought that to be the case. Never questioned such a thought, never had anybody challenge that idea actually to me, until getting involved in classical Lutheran education about 12 years ago on the high school level, coming across a work that I would like very much to recommend to you. It's one that I am very beholding to in terms of my understanding and some of the things that I would like to share with you here this afternoon in our sectional. It is entitled The Underground History of American Education, by a career public school teacher from New York, retired now. Actually, he was fired about 6 months after he was given the Most Outstanding Teacher of the Year award in the state of New York. But in any event, a man by the name of John Gatto, G-A-T-T-O, and this is a large work, but his rhetoric and writing style are anything but boring. I mean, it's tremendous chapter and verse stuff. Okay, in other words, he dots his I's, crosses his T's, provides you with all the references and everything, and yet it's not written at all in a textbook style that would put you to sleep. It reads incredibly interestingly, and he can turn a phrase wonderfully, and I commend it to you. Let perhaps this afternoon be kind of a whetting of the appetite for what you can get from him on a much more comprehensive and in-depth fashion. But I'd like to, on the basis of gleaning from him and some others, to review a little bit and to answer the question a little bit of the whys and the wherefores that brought, over a period of around 100 years, that institution that we call government-sponsored public education, often referred to in terms of its type of education, particularly over that which we are championing here, as progressive education. And when we talk here about classical education, we're not using that in any technical way. We use the word classical or classic in the same way Coca-Cola, when it came out with this new stuff, they called New Coke. Well, they had to call the original stuff something, so they called it Classic Coke, and by that it simply meant the old stuff, right? And we use that word classical in classical education here in a similar way. We just mean the old stuff, and by that not 1970, maybe 1770 or 1670 in our understanding. But the kind of education that has its roots in the Greco-Roman world, and that was revived in the context of Christian humanism and the Saxon visitation, as Dr. Koff related to us in the 1520s in connection with the Reformation under Luther at Wittenberg. So anyway, I call it politically incorrect because, generally speaking, it's just not politically very correct to talk about it these days much at all. Not even in education programs by the state to produce its contemporary teachers. So if this seems a bit new and revelatory, it would be for most everyone, I think, these days, simply because while you can go to the library and find these things out, nobody's writing about them today. So we thank Gatto very much for his work. Very few of us today are aware, therefore, of the history of education in America. I'm going to work from a manuscript here so I don't run off here at the mouth in relationship to tangential things. But hopefully we can do some of that maybe in the QA time. Okay? So bear with me. It's commonly thought, at least I did anyway, that whatever innovations have come over the centuries and decades, they have been conceived and implemented with the goal of improving pedagogy to enable the learner to learn more and to learn more effectively. Regardless of how the track record at any particular place or time is perceived, it is generally thought that the experts who have formulated innovations in the curriculum and methodology have done so out of the goal of improving education for all our children. That is, making them more educated. Unfortunately, this is not and has never been the case in connection with the advent of compulsory government-administered progressive education, as its beginnings can be traced in the middle of the 19th century in such urban regions as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Our objective here this afternoon is to explore the factors that gave rise to progressive education in this country and to understand and appreciate its goals, methods, and results, especially during the 20th century. Our CCLE conference this year has as its theme the exploration of the most basic question that must be answered before different approaches to education can be evaluated. And the question is, of course, why educate? What are the goals and objectives that education is directed to accomplish with our children? Only when the goals and objectives are understood are we in a position to evaluate any given approach. It is concerning this basic question that the roots of progressive education in our country, and indeed throughout the Western world, made a radical change during the middle part of the 19th century, misprint, beginning in Prussia. When the Prussian army went into a flawlessly executed battle and engagement after days of forced march to save Wellington's bacon from certain defeat by Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, a surprised Western world took note. Prussia's understanding, and all of the militaries in the Western world wanted to know what that was. Prussia's understanding of how to train, manage, and execute a large military contingency to achieve a singular objective with disciplined, coordinated precision as set forth by field commanders was quickly understood as to its implications of employing a grand labor force, harnessing the energies of coal and later petroleum to push the Industrial Revolution into a new age of mass production. First in Prussia, then in England, and then finally in the United States, industrialization produced a tremendous upheaval in national identity and purpose. Visionary industrialists, government officials, and educators began to understand the tremendous possibilities for mass production fueled by coal and petroleum. Industrialization brought with it, therefore, dreams of a utopian existence, an existence of the production of endless material advances in the standard of American living. Coal and petroleum could fuel the production and operation of machines, factories, and assembly lines that could, with rightly trained, efficient mass labor, crank out an endless array of inexpensively produced goods and gadgets that would both eradicate poverty and disease and produce a standard of living for all unheard of in the history of the world. It is important to understand the advantages envisioned and achieved for a mass society by the successful schooling and social adaptation of a mass labor force during the 100 years from the 1880s through the 1970s. In short, it was the physical comfort of all: food, shelter, cars, and televisions for all with relative personal security thrown in. A predictable world with a great amount of freedom from anxieties of the unknowns of life. In order for such a vision, and this is the vision they had, to be realized, a trade-off nevertheless would be needed. The greater population of the country would have to be socialized and schooled to become something that they were not yet. That is, to become an efficient, effective mass labor force to both, on the one hand, produce the goods and then consume them in the pursuit of what would be understood as a better way of life in material living. Granted, the work would, for the most part, be strenuous, repetitive, and oftentimes mindlessly boring, but it would promise job security, a nice wage, and a chance to advance into a higher material standard of living. To provide for such a mass labor resource, an alliance between large corporate industrialists and government would be necessary to raise up, on the one hand, a system of compulsory government schooling designed to overturn and replace the traditional tasks of educating, to prepare our young to take advantage of liberty and freedom and make for themselves a life and career of their own choosing. That is, to replace that which was the traditional goals of education. Instead of educating for life in those terms, there would need to be schooling for social integration into a mass workforce for efficient, coordinated labor as prescribed, supervised, and evaluated by production goals of higher management. The old enterprise of educating for critical thought, problem solving, communication, and creative thinking would be retained, but not for the masses. Education would become now, as it had already become in Prussia, in England, an elitist enterprise for the brightest and best connected children. It would be restricted for a small minority who would be needed to take the place of those who had gone before as statesmen in government, to occupy the important professional positions of life in medicine and law and education, and also to occupy the important positions of upper corporate management. Indeed, for the masses, and this is important and I cannot emphasize it enough, and I am not using hyperbole. For the masses, education was seen as a threat and a liability to realizing the collective utopian visions for reasons that we will make clear. If the Christian vision is a life lived under the grace of the Lordship of Christ, being a good steward, serving Christ in the needs of the neighbor, the utopian vision that brought compulsory government education conceived of salvation in terms of economic justice for the collective material betterment of mankind. No greater condition for mankind could be conceived by these visionaries. The good life was understood as a life of production and consumption of an increasing array of material goods. If we extend this particularly into the latter half of the 20th century, one other component ever increasingly more important in the vision of the good life that was added particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, though not there before, certainly there before, but exploded in the decades of the 20th century, was not just simply the consumption of material goods, but entertainment. The visions that brought us compulsory progressive education were fueled by many with a religion-like zeal. But that zeal and vision was decidedly rationalistic, shaped by social Darwinism, Unitarian or atheist presuppositions, and thoroughly this-worldly. In short, the mental diet of children would have to undergo a radical change. The following elements would have to be neutralized or removed from the nurture of children, and uniform compulsory school was considered the best avenue to accomplish it. Note these carefully. These are the elements that would need to be removed in order to raise up the kind of mass labor force that would felt to be efficient and effective to achieve the objective. First of all, facility and language skills that enable critical thinking and speaking with others for persuasive interaction must be eliminated in all but the most gifted children, who would, of course, need these skills of education for upper management, the professions, and state governance. 2. The traditional narrative of American history that connects the Founding Fathers and documents to the significant events of our nation's history so as to distinguish what it means to be an American would have to be deconstructed. 3. The traditional historical narrative would have to be substituted with social studies, a regimen of simple, uninterpreted facts together with contemporary social values based on materialist consumption vision of the good life. 4. A radical dissolution of academic content of formal curriculum which familiarized students with serious literature, philosophy, theology, and so forth. This would have the effect of dampening any interest in economics, politics, or religion, especially historic Christianity. Replacement of phonics with whole language sight word reading, taking away code cracking skills and drills that allow for self-mastery of reading skills for anyone on their own. Combination of willing and unwilling students to be schooled and leveled off together, stratified by age. 7. Enlargement of the school day, days of the week, months of the year, years in the child's life to retard the labor force, neutralizing the drive and competitive spirit of young teenaged children, and reduce the out-of-school influences of child formation to reduce useful knowledge for independent livelihoods. 8. Shifting the oversight from parents, church, community leaders, and the students themselves to school bureaucratic officials progressively more remote from the students' local world. And last, progressive hostility to interpretive meanings shaped by religion. Is this not simply educational reform to do things better? The new compulsory progressive education amounted to a wholesale repudiation of the goals and means of traditional education, exchanging them for a scientifically designed mass schooling program. Its goal was not to raise up educated citizens, but rather to build a mass industrial labor force schooled for efficiency, not for intelligent critical interaction with one's life and world. An educated person in the envisioned labor force posed a threat to effective, efficient labor management to achieve efficiency and cost-effective production. Inculcating knowledge teaches workers to be able to perceive and calculate their grievances, making them formidable foes in labor issues. Moreover, the report of the Senate Committee on Education, for instance, in 1888, concluded the following, quote, "We believe that education is one of the principal causes of discontent of late years, manifesting itself among the laboring classes." The NEA, National Education Association, came into existence to organize and share the means and goals of molding and maintaining a teacher resource committed and equipping to implementing just such an educational program. Its 1918 report on cardinal principles of secondary education decreed that specific behaviors, health, and vocational training were the central goals of education, not mental development, not character, and not godliness. The strategy of gradualism was effective in the evolution of American education into a monolithic, compulsory, government-administered school system. The movement began in the East, especially in the cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and in the middle decades of the 19th century, and then to states in New England, moving to large cities like Chicago in the Midwest, to other larger urban centers, and then lastly to rural states and regions of the country during the first half of the 20th century. Gradualism was also involved in how compulsory education laws progressively evolved. Elwyn Wood Cubberleys, who was the Dean of Education at Stanford University, his work in 1934 entitled Public Education in the United States spelled out the strategy of gradualism perfectly in the following. At first, think of what's being proposed today by our president's wife concerning diet. At first, the laws are optional. They are only suggestions. Later, the law was to make statewide, but compulsory period, though, for the education that was required was short. 10 to 12 weeks is all. And then age limits, of course, were low. That is, only up to about, not at first, for instance, 12 years. After this, struggle came to extend the time, often, little by little, to extend the age limits downward to 8 and 7 and upward to 14, 15, or 16, to make the law apply to children attending private also and parochial schools, and to require cooperation from such schools for the proper handling of cases, to institute state supervision of local enforcement, to connect school attendance enforcement with child labor legislation of the state through a system of working permits. End quote. The goals of progressive education, the institution and expansion of compulsory schooling, and restrictive child labor laws were all designed to achieve the same goals: to intellectually dumb down but produce an efficient, effective labor force, and to guard against the greatest threat the utopian industrialists feared. They referred to it back then as overproduction, or what more commonly could be called in our midst, competition. The utopian program was influentially shaped by a cartel of rich visionary industrialists of names that we all know, and the foundations of which exist to this day to implement the same ends. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford. Think of the foundations of these men who are still shaping the bulk of movement and evolution of public education, even to this day, as they have long passed this world. For these ones greatly feared risking the great capital, and you have to realize here that this makes sense, okay? Fearing competition and, as they called it, overproduction. They greatly feared risking the great capital of their enterprises of harnessing coal, petroleum, and steel to a population of young, educated, and idealistic entrepreneurs. Imbued and equipped with a good education, such would be both willing, they knew, and able to build better and cheaper mousetraps, or for that matter, Model T horseless carriages, that did not need, of course, a new model every year. If supply increases, we all know, all things being equal, price is going to drop. And if price drops, then capital cannot be protected. It is as simple as that. In the older economy, of course, which was greatly agrarian, it was important to parents to toughen the minds of their children through reading serious literature, writing, debate, and managing numbers well. Such activities and skills of education foster a desire and appreciation of independence and creativity that begins in early childhood. But that kind of young person was just what was feared. With the new utopian vision, the purpose of curtailing the labor of young people and keeping them into schools for longer periods of time and longer years in their development was to deprive them of an educated, creative mind and the means to apply it in the marketplace during their most energetic and idealistic years. Remember, of course, the shorter life expectancy also in these days. 100, 150 years ago. Prior to coal-fired mass production, the notion of using one's education to enter your own business enterprise was seen as the most positive exercise of freedom and liberty for American youth. During colonial days in America, if a young man had not established a successful business as an entrepreneurial tradesman by the ages of 13 or 14, he was considered a failure and probably would have to become what was considered the most derogatory work classification at the time. He was considered a common laborer. The connection was both simple and inescapable. Adam Smith's understanding of a market run by self-regulating competition would be the death of a planned, managed economy. The presence of independently minded, well-educated Americans had to be curtailed. Excessive overproduction of brains was understood as the root cause of overproduction of virtually anything and everything. James Bryant Conant, president of Harvard from 1935 to 1953, wrote a defense of the whole program when some, as we get to the middle of the 20th century, were beginning to raise doubts about the whole program in his article entitled The American High School Today. For Conant, progressive education was a triumph of Anglo-Germanic pragmatism. It brilliantly curtailed the American entrepreneurial spirit, and for perfectly justifiable reasons. If capital investments were vulnerable to millions of young, self-reliant, educated, and resourceful entrepreneurials, no one would risk putting up the huge amounts of capital necessary to create or sustain the commercial, industrial, financial machine of mass production. The whole enterprise would either at first never have gotten off the ground or would have soon collapsed. Listen to Rockefeller's understanding here in his occasional paper number 1 of 1906, written to the General Education Board. Quote, "In our dreams," notice these are visionaries, "in our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions, that is, intelligent and character education, the old education, the present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these folk or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is simple. We will organize children, and we will teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way." The one area that I'd like particularly, kind of tried to share here at least the grand vision. What would this mean, though? What would be the most central thing that you could think of that would need to be dumbed down? And if you could dumb down this area, okay, all of the rest pretty well is going to collapse. The area I'm thinking about is reading. Reading. Listen to the program and the rationale set forth for the place that reading would occupy and how it would be carried out under the new progressive education model. There has been a consensus down through the centuries, and certainly not challenged in the least by progressive schooling proponents, and that is important. They're not challenging. That attentive reading of tough-minded writing that wrestles with the central challenges of human existence is the best, the fastest, and the cheapest way known for learning how to think critically for yourself. That is unchallenged. I will read that sentence. It's kind of complex. I'll read it again. That attentive reading of tough-minded writing that wrestles with the central challenges of human existence is the best, the fastest, and the cheapest known way for learning how to think critically for yourself. Serious reading, with rigorous discussion of its contents, of course, requires, therefore, the development of critical thinking. And critical thinking comes from such reading. It requires the development of critical thinking, articulate speaking, and in a summary phrase, the mastery of human language. Learning how to read and argue formed the foundation of a solid education for a learned and literate citizenry. Nowhere was progressive schooling more devastating of the goals and methods of education than in the area of reading. In 1812, barely 4 in 1,000 Americans could not read proficiently. In 1818, if we had the New York Times bestseller list that they would put out, do you know what the bestseller was in 1818 in the area of fiction literature? I know, you have to try to remember. Let's see, was that 1818 or 1819? What was it? It's gone through several movie versions, I think at least 3. Hollywood's done at least 3 of this great novel, The Last of the Mohicans. It sold in relationship to the population of the time. If it was out today and sold the same amount of copies, it would be selling 20 million copies. In that particular work, sophisticated philosophy, religion, economics, history, and a sophisticated vocabulary runs there throughout. The actual reading, if you don't get the unabridged versions today, would challenge your postgraduate student today. And yet it was common fare for just the ordinary, normal public like we might buy the old dime novels in 1818. In 1818, barely 4 in 1,000 Americans could not read proficiently. In other words, they could pick up The Last of the Mohicans and read it like we'd be reading the Reader's Digest. At the hands of progressive education, the key to dumbing down a future mass labor force was to retard and to restrict the ability to read by how reading would be taught and what would be read. It was the ancient Greeks who made an astounding discovery that often isn't realized by them or credited to them, but they discovered that advanced the ability in order to read and to master a language when they invented letters to represent sounds in their language. The naming of sounds rather than things was an incredible breakthrough. Communicating abstractions in picture language requires more time and training to master a language for most people. If we wanted to think about a language that has no letters, that of course makes for sounds and so forth, think of Chinese. Every word is a pictograph. The Greeks created words by sounds and combinations of sounds, and they understood that proper syntactical writing was an easy-to-learn guide to the sounding of letters and words, leading them to construction and understanding from the words to the understanding of phrases and sentences, conveying even the most then complex abstract ideas. Learning sight-sound correspondences is easy. The Romans made it even easier by actually naming the letters close to the very sound of the letters. Greeks didn't do that. I mean, it was Omicron, okay? Theta, and so forth. But the Romans advanced by closely naming the letter with the sound. Christian missionaries adapted the Roman alphabet to English in the 7th century. Wasn't very easy to do, and we know, of course, it must have been difficult. Nevertheless, they did in the 7th century, and the rest, as they say, is history. For a long time, there was not much to read, so it wasn't that big of a problem. There wasn't much to read in English, so big deal. Right? That is, Latin being the language of learning and academics. Except, however, a book did come. Dr. Koff made mention of it, okay? And it became, of course, the first greatest English primer for reading in the English language, and that was the King James Version of the Bible. It became, as it were, the universal textbook also of early American history. Decoding words in the Bible by learning the alphabet and its phonetical sounds became the most popular way that children quickly learned how to read among all social classes, rich and poor. And as the children learned to read and master the most complex sentences and vocabulary at the earliest of ages, they were constantly rewarded and motivated to learn even more as they then became more enlightened about the fundamental questions of human existence that everyone is interested in. What is life? What is death? And in the face of death, how can the future be secured by a loving and merciful Creator and Redeemer? Not surprisingly, it was a German and a disciple of Rousseau who published the first Look-Say reading primer in 1791. Kids would learn words through pictures. I can remember, of course, my first reading lesson using just such a method in the public school that I went to in the first grade, using pictures to teach word association, the method we now call whole language or word instruction. It was the first grade, and there was the corresponding picture for me on the large easel with these words that I remember still to this day. Look, baby, see the water. Well, it was Horace Mann and his second wife, Mary Peabody, standard names in progressive education history, who promoted the word picture method of teaching reading, as then Thomas Glaudet set forth such a program of sight reading for the deaf. Reading to read in this way, of course, made sense for the deaf. You certainly couldn't use phonics, now could you? They would teach this method of teaching deaf children how to first read, and then on that basis, how to speak. The first line in his primer was, Frank had a dog. His name was Spot. But Mann and later progressive educators sought to adopt the picture whole language approach to teaching reading to children who had no hearing difficulties and who already had considerable facility in spoken language. He battled for generations the Boston school authorities until his death, seeking to bring Gaudet's whole language approach to reading in Boston. Said Mann, I am satisfied. Our greatest error in teaching children to read lies in beginning with the alphabet. It wasn't until the crusade for whole language by Francis Parker and other reading antagonists in the 1880s that the push got off the ground with the help of a psychologist by the name of James McKean Cattell, who conducted an experiment with a contraption called a tachistoscope that allegedly proved that we read whole words, not letters. In fact, it was not until 1965 that anyone bothered to check his experiment, which discovered, of course, that he was dead wrong. People do read letters, they do not read words. Indeed, reported Gatto, there have been 124 legitimate studies performed between 1911 and 1981 attempting to prove Cattell and other whole world advocates right. None of the studies have confirmed whole word reading as effective. Nevertheless, the progressive adoption of the whole language approach to reading promised, of course, a financial bonanza to textbook publishing companies. Moreover, it provided just the wholesale approach to manage a systematic dumbing down and retardation of children's learning skills, giving rise, of course, to the famous or the perhaps infamous Dick and Jane reading series. Anyone remember that? That was my reading system. Only now, several generations later, it was Dick who had a dog, and his name was Spot. By 1920, sight reading was on its way to replacing phonics as the standard method of teaching reading in American government-sponsored education. By the 1930s, the Dick and Jane series was on its way to becoming the most popular whole-language reading series to retard and dumb down children's reading skills. Compare the following characteristics of Dick and Jane with learning how to read the Bible. In 1930, the Dick and Jane primer taught 68 sign words in 39 pages of story text, with one illustration per page. A total of 565 words, not different words, 565 words were used. There were only 68 different words. It also came along with a teacher's guide that was 87 pages long. Over the course, though, of 20 years, the series was progressively dumbed down even more, so that in 1951, when I happened to have entered the world of Dick and Jane, the same book was expanded to 172 pages from 39, to 184 illustrations with a total of 2,603 words. The teacher's guidebook swelled to 182 pages, and all of this to teach no longer 87 words, but just 58 words. In 1930, the word look was repeated 8 times. In 1951, it was repeated 110 times. In the earlier version, O was repeated 12 times. In the later 51 version, it was repeated 138 times. In the first book, C, the word C gets 27 repetitions. In the second, 176. And instead of reading about, of course, the great Noachian flood, or the battle between David and Goliath, or the crucifixion of Jesus, children learned a few dozen words repeated ad nauseum and expressing with a colorful picture on each page such simple-minded drivel as Dick and Spot going to the grocery store, spilling some milk, and Officer Friendly walking them back home. The famous Dr. Seuss of the Cat in the Hat fame later in life, on an interview that he gave in 1981, put the mindlessness of all of this in great relief, reflecting on his own work. He said about the book, The Cat in the Hat, "I did it for a textbook house and they gave me a word list. That was due to the Dewey Revolt in the 20s, in which they threw out phonics. Reading and went to word recognition as if you're reading a Chinese pictograph instead of blending sounds or different letters. I think killing phonics was one of the greatest causes of illiteracy in the country. Anyway, they had it all worked out that a healthy child at the age of 4 can only learn so many words in a week. So there were 223 words to use in this book. I read the list 3 times and I almost went out of my head. I said I'll read it once more, and if I can find 2 words that rhyme, I'll title my book after them. I found cat and hat, and said the title of my book will therefore be The Cat in the Hat." In 1840, with records from Connecticut and Massachusetts, virtually everyone could read, and at a very proficient level with almost no formal schooling in terms of months in the year or years of one's youth. By 1940, 100 years later, 96% of whites and 80% of blacks were literate. However, at the turn of the century, 60 years later, black illiteracy doubled to 40% and white illiteracy quadrupled to 17%. These results came over a 60-year period in which expenditures for education increased 400%. Between 1955 and 1991, student-teacher ratios decreased by 40%, teacher compensation increased by 50%, but the annual amount of annual expenditure per student increased by 350%. In 1993, the National Adult Literacy Survey surveyed 190 million United States adults over the age of 16, with an average school attendance of 12.4 years, and came up with the following results. 1. 42 million Americans over the age of 26 cannot read. 50 million Americans can recognize printed words on a 4th or 5th grade level, but cannot write simple messages or letters. 51 million Americans are limited to 6th to an 8th grade reading level. A majority of this group, however, could not figure out the price per ounce of peanut butter in a 20-ounce jar if the 20-ounce jar cost $1.99 when they could round off their numbers to a whole number. 30 million have a 9th or 10th grade level reading proficiency. This group, and all of the previous, cannot understand a simplified written explanation of the procedures used by attorneys and judges in selecting juries. That's instructive to know. Recent events here. About 3.5% were deemed to have reading proficiency ready to begin college work. That 3.5% compares to about 30% of all high school students in 1940. 96.5% of the American adult population is considered mediocre to illiterate where deciphering print is concerned. The ability to interpret what is read as reported means. These people, therefore, must rely upon others to tell them what things reported about their world mean. In 1882, fifth grade students using the Appleton School Reader read from authors such as Shakespeare, Thoreau, George Washington, John Bunyan, Daniel Webster, Samuel Johnson, Lewis Carroll, Thomas Jefferson, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. In 1955, a fifth grade teacher in Minneapolis was told that children are not to be expected to spell the following words correctly: back, big, call, came, can, did, day, dog, down, get, good, if, in, is, it, have, he, home, like, little, man, morning, mother, my, night, off, out, over, people, play, ran, said, saw, she, some, soon, there, them, their, time, to, up, us, very, water, we, went, where, when, will, would. Reading, language. Classical education understood that the foundations, of course, for learning involved the facility of language on three levels. The ability to understand simple relationships between words, things and concepts, grammar level. Analytic skills, the ability to see parts of the whole of something complex and to distinguish between sense and nonsense. Or rhetoric, the ability to creatively construe your own thoughts, truth claims, ideas, or evaluations or applications to think creatively. Right? These were the foundations for all other learning. This was understood by progressive educators. The element here that we find, unfortunately, though, is that by 1980, we ceased becoming, for all intended purposes, a nation that made much of anything. Manufacturing went elsewhere, where it was more competitive and cheaper. The third world entered into the industrial age, and Europe had gotten back on its feet from being devastated economically by 2 world wars. So the original purposes for which progressive education was established are anachronistic in relationship to the needs of our country. Therefore, progressive education has had to undergo a change, and there has been a tremendous interest in trying to achieve such things as learning. But no one involved in either governance, educational administration, has any remembrance, of course, because they didn't receive it, of the education that provided those things. And between politics, of course, and the influence also of powerful unions, seeking to reform this educational system has been very difficult. Well, this was the what portion. The evaluative elements here I'm saving for our for round 2 on this, if you have some interest, but I'd like to throw things out for some of your own questions or observations here. Again, this is just a small window, but at least looking at beginnings, and particularly in the impact in reading, I think has been important to understand.
Yeah, this isn't a topic that I had considered too much. My wife has her master's degree in teaching, and she's specialized in reading, and talked to me about these kind of things briefly, and she had noted, the difference in the introduction of whole language development. But one of the things that kind of caught my attention was your talk of, literacy and so forth in the 19th century. And I'm kind of a student. I enjoy reading about Civil War history.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that fascinates me is reading the letters from soldiers home. I'm not talking
Precisely.
about colonels.
Oh yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
talking about
The
colonels.
plowboys.
I'm talking about
Yeah, the
privates.
plowboys. The
And they write
16,
back home and they're
15,
thinking about
16-year-old
matters of
kids.
life,
Yes.
existence,
Yeah.
death, and I'm thinking even the most educated among us now don't reflect on those things at that level.
And the vocabulary they used. Yeah. And they had almost what we would call formal education, almost none. A few weeks out of the year, a few years out of their life. And to a certain extent, particularly in an agrarian culture, there was no way that the family economy could allow anyone who could do anything over the age of 3. You were a part of the building of that home unit. You couldn't spend your whole day not doing anything and being productive on that. So formal schooling, as we think of it, here's a school, you go to the school and you learn sitting at a desk, was something that was done, but not very many days, not very many hours out of the day, days out of the week, weeks out of the year, or years out of one's life. Yes?
Our school has a low population of Lutherans.
Yes?
I was wondering how we could get them to essentially see that we have become slaves to the system.
And we have. We have.
When you listen to what you just said,
Yes,
we
you are
become
right.
slaves to the system. How to get them to recognize that and then choose to sacrifice for a different option.
I would like, if you can, and I'm just saying, it is thinking through with you that question specifically that is the topic for our next session. The so what about it. That if this is not what we want for our children, then how do we make an effective case, and what is it? How do we help our own families, parents of our baptized children, critically answer this question? Because I think this one must be answered first. You cannot sell them on what kind of education their children need until they first come to grips with the answer of the question, why educate them in the first place? They're in no position to evaluate the various options as to what might be good or not good until they critically think through that question. And that's a question that we have not been asking in our, we've always been kind of a, well, we all know sort of a mode here. But I think critically thinking through that is the key to beginning the discussion. What is it that education is going to accomplish? Because if you say, oh, this is a good school. Well, a good school, what do we mean it's a good school, okay? Usually what we would mean is that a good school is a school that efficiently and effectively accomplishes not your goals, but its goals. Well, what are their goals? We often, our parents think, well, I got to find out where I live. I want to live in a neighborhood that, quote, has good schools rather than bad schools. I happen to think in contemporary public education today, you ought to fear the good schools more than the bad schools, because they're going to be doing a more effective job of transforming your kid to believing all sorts of things that you don't.
When you look at the students we get, who are they?
Yeah.
There are children of educators in that system,
Yeah.
pastors. No, but seriously, we have a high population of teachers who work for a district, and they won't even send their own children there. So how do we get that across to the population who we want to reach?
I think part of it is that our people have not critically thought through how they would answer that question, and they do not critically understand how the school, the local school, answers that question. Yes?
Because the teachers are coming out of our universities with this progressive theory, how is progressive education affecting our universities and even our, the elite universities like Harvard and Yale. How did they get in there, and what is it doing in that level?
It's a very good question.
Is that session
In a sense, actually, not necessarily, but remember we talked about how the notion is that you're supposed to have an elitist education for the statesmen and so forth, and the Ivy League schools and everything were intended, plus the prestigious prep schools on the East Coast and so forth, were retained for the next generation's intelligentsia.
Right.
Okay. Well, what has evolved and what has happened, okay, is that real critical thinking and the exposure of the things that bring about critical thinking have progressively become absent from these institutions for political and ideological reasons.
So their model then is going to crumble from underneath if they don't have their. That's a good thing. One's coming out the top, the ones who are thinking.
If nihilism takes over your fundamental worldview, so that life must be understood as providing escapist and coping mechanisms, because there are no answers to the major issues and questions of human existence, then what is an education supposed to do?
Exactly.
This is the problem, okay? And it's a problem also for the third grader who by the time they get to fifth grade and they have heard to all the questions they wish to ask of their teacher that are interesting, that there is no answer to it. They become little, young, functional nihilists.
Yes.
And they are ready for the escapist life, believing there are no answers. And when there are no answers, what do? You stop asking the questions. You stop asking the questions.
Just look at the recent development of technology, where that's taking us. The emphasis is almost entirely going in the area of entertainment.
Yes.
Whether it be a cell phone, now you can have movies on your cell phone.
Sure.
Even though it can be utilized for great good in reading books.
Serving us where we find our greatest needs. And our greatest needs now, okay, are to cope.
I was going to comment, I know Albert Nock wrote an excellent piece regarding, even at the time it was, what was it, the 30s, I believe, an excellent piece regarding even then the decline of the Ivy League schools, just as you had mentioned. Also, I wanted to point out that at the time that they're devising the system or the replacement of phonics-based reading to more of what did you call it?
Sight reading or whole language.
Yeah. Not less than a century. I've been reading Gibbon lately, and he has a paragraph here that is a choice observation regarding the illiteracy of the barbarians and what that meant for them culturally. And it was well known. I mean, he wasn't making some unique observation. It was well known what the impact of literacy was and the necessity of literacy in culture. So.
Yes. Dr. Koff pointed out, though, in higher education, and it's not just at State U, certainly at the prestigious universities, the necessity of we have to innovate. Okay, it's innovation. Okay, so the idea that you just maintain something that has to have some excellence is not going to get the attention, the funding, the so forth, and so. Careful, good education is not necessarily what we need in history. We just need fill in the blank. Ethnic studies, black studies, gay studies. But we need to innovate in that regard. Dr. Kopp, did you have a comment or remark here about this history that we've surveyed?
Very persuasive, very convincing. One of the issues with the best schools is that the arts and sciences faculty and education faculty don't have much in common. Even in okay state schools, especially in Ivies, people still teach subjects. They still hire And what we hold against the ed people is that these people have no subject. They teach better. And one of the things that classical education does for teachers, which is so wonderful, is that they've been, given their 3 awful years in the ed school, and then they're told, no, you're not an organizer who organizes activities. You're a professor, a teacher who teaches a subject to children. And to see, it's a cure for burnout, it's a cure for cynicism. I mean, obviously, education should be for children. But guess what? This not only works for children, it works for teachers.
Yes. And the big challenge, of course, is that if we want to get involved, and you all know this, if you want to get involved in classical education as a teacher, the first thing you're going to have to do is to enroll as a student. Because it wasn't the education we got. Right? We didn't have this education. So you can't teach what you haven't. So the first thing we have to do, and I want you to feel normal there. And I want to give you a means of being able to compare a sense of normalcy. At our classical Lutheran high school in Colorado Springs, one of the courses, we had a 4-year Western Civ sequence. And the 3rd year with our juniors was the Age of Reason, basically surveying in Western thought the latter part of the 17th on into the 18th century. We avoided textbooks, so we were always, all the way from Greco-Roman period, we're reading primary resources. And in literature, philosophy, political theory, which is coming on there at this particular time and so forth, we picked out 12 primary resources for the juniors to be reading, and that I was to be the teacher. The first time I taught that course, I had read 3 of those works. Now I have 14 years of higher education. I have 4 earned degrees. I had read 3 of those. So if you feel, that, gosh, I think I may have to go back, and learn this, the student, where was I that for? Well, I was 2 weeks ahead, and well, we'll get there next, but I hadn't read Bacon's Novum Organum. I hadn't read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, I hadn't read that work. I read some of Don Quixote in Spanish in high school. But that's our challenge. Our challenge is to become, on the way anyways, of picking up things that we missed, that we didn't get in our education. Because we're a product of the very education that we're seeking to provide an alternative to. That question, why educate though? That I think is the central issue, and we want to try to take that up on our next session. Hello, everybody.
Just about time.
Just about time. Okay, very good. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you.